the lifeblood of humanity. It is most properly called currency because, like an electrical current, money is power. It commands respect, and its chief companion is influence, to the point where some will do anything to get it. The illusion and pursuit of mundane desires may mislead you down a spiraling path of self-destruction. History shows us that wealth is fleeting, elusive, and too much is never enough. The current of economics can be likened to the current of a river. It must flow. As it flows through the society, it sparks creativity and innovation, drives industry, and defines the aspiration of its people. The abundant economic potential of this flow may have some wondering why there is such a disparity between the haves and have-nots, or the rich and the poor. To understand the flow of economics, one must understand the science of ecology and how it's connected to the economy.
African people make up the majority of the world's population, and we sit on the vast majority of the world's wealth. Why have we not been able to turn that into political and economic power for ourselves? African Americans spent $1.3 trillion last year, making us the 16th wealthiest nation in the world. Why have we not turned those riches into wealth to develop our community? But before we examine that, let's look at the three essential components of world civilization.
Economics, politics, and culture are the foundation of what we call systems analysis. And we need to appreciate that systems analysis and its application to human development, world development. We're standing here at the first capital of America, Federal Hall, where the foundations of economics, politics, and culture were put in place for America. Economics is your productive, creative capability. Politics is your management capability. And culture are the deep values.
On January 1st, 1863, the political climate surrounding the enslavement of Africans shifted when President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation Act. What's conveniently left out of that discussion was, and still is, the continued demand for cheap labor. Today, the political climate centers on immigration reform, but what we're not being told is why. There's a deep-rooted connection between immigration, free labor, and America. Ironically, the major part of the goods consumed by Americans are produced overseas by a form of cheap labor or harvested from American farms by migrant workers. The reality is that not much has changed since 1863.
Some may say slavery still exists.
When the very first Congress of the United States of America met in 1790 to craft all the laws of this new country, they created the country's immigration and naturalization law. Naturalization law refers to the process by which one must follow when you are not born in a country and you seek to become a citizen. So they determined, these founders of the United States of America, that in order to become a naturalized citizen in this new nation, one must be white. So we can see in that founding law evidence of how successful this invention was. Not only that, but when you require whiteness in order to access citizenship, they built in a direct line between white and American. In fact, we preserve it linguistically today. I'm just an American. Some of you are Asian American, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, for example. Contingent Americans, in other words. Even if my family came last week, I get to just be American.
When we study American history, we see that from its foundation, every fabric of this country has needed foreign labor to complete its development. The discussion about what and who defines us clearly centers on race, ethnicity, and lastly, country of origin. Power can be seen as a table where everyone wants a seat, but there are limited spaces available. Either you have your seat or not. Today, we're seeing what appears to be a resurgence in the struggle for the preservation of identity playing out on the global stage. However, what we are in fact witnessing is fear. Fear in losing seats at that table. The question that must now be asked is, what role does race play in this dynamic?
What you have is a tension between nationalism and globalism. So globalism would suggest that you have few barriers to trade, that things will be able to move relatively freely, that there may be tariffs, but they may be small. So people will be encouraged to trade and to think globally. The nationalism says us first. And that's what we saw with Brexit, older people especially, but lots of people were saying, you know, all these immigrants coming into the UK, and I don't have a job. Because with the European Union, you have fairly free movement across borders. So if you were a student in Germany and you wanted to go to Oxford, you could apply, you could go, you would not have to get any visas or do anything like that. So your competition, theoretically, for the kid in the UK who also wants to go to Oxford. So you have basically free movement, and many people felt the free movement constricted their choices. Here in the United States, you see the same thing with Mr. Trump having anchored his campaign around immigration, around building a wall, around banning Muslims, and all these crazy things that he came up with, which he now probably will not do. But in any case, what he did do is incited those people who feel left out.
Since the dawn of early humanity, mankind has migrated from place to place in search of a better way. Interestingly enough, even the so-called worthy or self-proclaimed deserving once upon a time themselves too were immigrants. In this, we can clearly see the role economics has played in the development of civilization. To make sense of this, you must go back through time and retrace the steps of the ancients. Our journey to the past will begin with an examination of political and economic development along the Nile or HAPI River. The Africans that migrated to the Nile used the ecological system masterfully to build the world's great first mega economy. The Nile or HAPI River made ancient Egypt an economic giant by way of agriculture.
Once a year, the Nile or HAPI River overflowed its banks. When the flood waters receded, the inundation left behind rich silt in the soil that made the earth rich and from which each season several crops were yielded. The political and economic development of Nile Valley civilization began with the Nile or HAPI River. The Africans that lived along the HAPI River understood the fundamental importance of economics and its complementary component, politics. This system of economics and politics laid the groundwork for the organizational structure responsible for building great monuments like the pyramids. To achieve this monumental feat, the ancient Egyptians relied on two main economic resources. One was its vibrant agriculture, and two, its people, the combination of which made Northeast Africa an economic model. The architectural legacy it left behind is just an example of ancient Egypt's economic and political strength. How were the ancient Egyptians able to translate their agricultural wealth into a system of governing that managed the creation of their structures? What data did they leave behind? Perhaps the keys are in the monuments themselves.
The evidence that we have are the number of the stones for building this pyramid. This pyramid only 2,300,000 blocks. Each one weighed 2 tons, 2.5 tons. Building the Great Pyramid only can be a very important evidence that the government in that time, in Dynasty 4,500 years ago, had a very strong economy. Over 9 million stones had been moved in one dynasty. No economy in the world can do that.
If we go back in history, the Nile secured the means of transporting for trade purposes the goods and resources that those communities needed to eat, to dress, for housing, for health. We must clarify here immediately that we're talking of Black Africans.
Economics is a major factor in the development of any culture, any civilization, any nation, any empire, and any institution. The Africans that lived along the HAPI River understood quite well that their governmental system had to have as its foundation economics.
The political and the management of the structure of the pyramid, I think it's more important for us to understand than building the pyramid. Because you can imagine, when Khufu took the throne, became a king, his architect Hemiono, who built the pyramid, will come with maps to him and told him what kind of management will be. Khufu and Hemiono was 25 years old when they began to think about building this pyramid. Then the management of how you manage the workmen in one area, and also the supervision for the workmen to have breakfast in the morning, drinking beer and bread, was a national diet for the workmen who built the pyramid. If you close your eyes and go back 5,000 years ago and think about the quarry location, the workmen moving the stones and putting the stones on the top of the pyramid. And you can imagine medical treatment, how they organize to save the workmen if anything happened to them. You can imagine the management in the area of the Rashe, the mouth of the lake. And Ankaf was the supervisor of the whole area. The management of the Rashe is the most important thing that happened to show how the government was so strong to organize building the pyramid. The workforce entering inside, limestone, granite, basalt, all this type of things was very important to see. The organization of building the pyramid is more important to show than building the pyramid itself.
One of the earliest known civilizations on Earth, Egypt, or Kemet, finds its roots in a very auspicious beginning. Most people are familiar with Egypt being the birthplace of history, the Great Pyramids, and temples, but few are aware of the climatic change that was the genesis of this great culture. Approximately 10,000 years ago, there was an ecological change that caused the monsoon rains in Africa to shift southward, resulting in the northern part of Africa to gradually transform from a tropical rainforest to the desert we see today. This climate change became the catalyst for the vast migration of people towards river valleys, in particular the HAPI or Nile River, where economics, politics, and culture came together seamlessly in a way that was unparalleled in the ancient world.
The concept coming out of the African world, at its rudimentary level and at its developmental level, was the 3 C's: communal, cooperative, and collective spiritual development. You didn't build the pyramids to worship an individual. You're building pyramids to link the human experience through the pharaoh to the divine experience. In the African tradition, there weren't enslaved persons that built the pyramids. The workers were building pyramids and other sacred buildings because they would inherit a place in the afterlife.
Every household in the north and the south of Egypt participated in building the pyramid by sending workforce and food to help the king. I found the tombs of the pyramid builders that show to the whole world that the builder of the pyramids were Egyptians, and the builder of the pyramids were not slaves. Because if they were slaves, they will never be buried beside the pyramids. The workmen were sent by the households to help the king. In return, they did not pay tax. This is a very important point to understand. The king completely depended on the number of the workmen that came through the support of the households, based on the discovery of the tombs of the pyramid builders, because I found the lower cemetery for the workmen who moved the stones, and they found the upper cemetery that for the artisans, the technicians, and I found the area for sorting salted fish, and the area for making bread, and the area they lived in it. And this is why I do believe that there was 10,000 workmen built the pyramids in Dynasty 4.
Cooperative economics is the cornerstone of Nile Valley culture. The ancient Egyptians understood that in order to be successful, they must work together collectively and amongst their neighbors, the details and evidence of which were chronicled throughout various locations in Egypt.
This tomb here in Aswan is one of the greatest examples of economics in the early world. We're here at the tomb of Hakuf. Hakuf was a governor of Elephantine during the Old Kingdom. In fact, he served under the Pepi II, who was the last ruler of the 6th dynasty. It's really important to understand or come to this tomb because there's certain things here that really get into how the people saw economics and trade and commerce with other African nations. The inscriptions of this tomb detail the accounts of the countless trade expeditions Hakuf had to the kingdom of Yam. One of the things he was responsible for was mapping out various trade routes. Economics really played the role in what they were doing to develop civilization. They were trading goods from the interior of the continent and out into other parts of the world because the Delta area became the crossroads or became the trade routes into and out of Africa, into Asia, into Europe. One of the things he noticed was that throughout the time, certain other groups started to come in and settle in from the west into the Nile Valley. This upset the trade flow of goods from south to north and east to west, if you will. And what happened was he feared for his life. So one of the things that he requested was an escort, or the king of Yam, or the ruler of Yam at that time, provided an escort for him to go back to Kemet or into Egypt. This is very important because it shows two things. One, it shows the relationship between the kingdoms of the Nile. It shows that they had a friendly relationship, a trade, commerce, economic relationship. And it also shows that there were other kingdoms, other peoples migrating into the Nile, which we know eventually will upset the balance of flow into the Nile Valley. This constant flux of people into the Nile didn't stop there. It continued throughout history.
In order to have a greater understanding of trade expeditions carried out by ancient Egypt, we traveled to the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago to speak with Dr. Bruce Williams.
In the late Old Kingdom, and then several other periods in the history of Egypt, the Egyptians sent large expeditions to the Red Sea and sailed up the Red Sea to Punt to get the same products that they would get from Yam, pretty much. And that was an alternative, so they could go around some of these rising powers on the Nile Valley. And this back and forth between Nile route or Western Desert route and the Red Sea is, let's say, a theme that recurs again and again in the more ancient history.
We have very important texts about the relation between Egypt and the south of Nubia. How the Egyptian will go to bring products for the temples, for the wealth of the temples, and gold from Nubia. Then the Egyptians building the pyramid actually made the Egyptian to control all the sources from outside. The only thing that the Egyptian will export and give outside, in my opinion, was only gold.
Before money existed, the universal aspect of currency centered on trade, or what's more commonly referred to as the barter system. The demand placed on goods or services determined its value. This same principle of give and take is demonstrated in the current exchange or stock markets around the world today.
So if you go back to, say, ancient Egypt, before money as we know it today existed, how did you know the rich person from the poor person? Well, you knew that based on the resources they had at their disposal. You knew that based on their wealth, and wealth was seen as a more universal concept than just how much money I have in my pocket. So for example, let's say that I am sitting here and I have this pineapple, and I really don't need a pineapple. I don't want this pineapple. I don't even like pineapple. But I know the pineapple has value because I know that there's somebody out there that wants a pineapple. But instead of wanting a pineapple, I actually want bananas. So what might I do? Well, I might go and let's say I go into the marketplace and I find out that 2 bananas is worth 1 pineapple. Well, I'm gonna have to find somebody who has bananas and say, hey, I'll give you this pineapple in exchange for your 2 bananas. And what's gonna happen is that the number of bananas necessary to get 1 pineapple is gonna fluctuate and change based on the supply and demand of bananas and pineapples. So if pineapple suddenly became really popular and very rare, then it might take 20 bananas to get 1 pineapple. Or if bananas suddenly were in oversupply, then it might require a lot of bananas to buy 1 pineapple, because people will say, oh, bananas are not a big deal, everybody has one. So ultimately, supply and demand are what drives any economic system.
When we think of economics, we have to think of food, we have to think of clothing, we have to think of shelter, we have to think of safety. So how do we handle this? Well, you must have some means of exchanging goods with other people and services with other people, so that you can get the goods and services that they have, and they can get the goods and service you have, so that you can have a broader perspective in terms of how you supply and provide for your group.
We knew very early on that as you grew one plant, the next plant season you did a different kind of plant in order to put back into the soil the nutrients that the former plant took out of it. That's reciprocity. And so it wasn't just about, I'm going to grow all these string beans, I'm going to grow all this stuff and take it out and strip the earth of that and then leave and go away. It was always an exchange. And that's what I think we should really recognize, is that economy is a question of exchange. And the rule of exchange is what affirms my being.
Economics first starts with the relationship between people. And so you have to ask, what was it about that culture that all of these different groups were able to come together, speaking different languages, and being able to work together to harvest enough food for everyone in that particular floodplain?
The HAPI is represented or can be thought of as a nature. And as a nature, it is the energy and the life force of the Heru, of the river itself.
HAPI is the oldest name of what we know as the Nile River today. HAPI is broken into 2 sections. We have HAPI of the south, which is Rashi, coming down, meeting HAPI of the north, Mahet, at Khartoum, and then becoming the Nile River, the longest river in the world.
Heru Kesbet, the Blue Nile, coming out of the land of Kash, known as Kush, Ethiopia, and Heru Hech, the White Nile, coming out of central equatorial Africa.
But that is the brightest star in our hemisphere, also called Sirius A and the Dog Star. When it rose each year, it caused an ecological change in our atmosphere, causing the monsoon rains in the highlands of Ethiopia and the rainforest, coming down the Nile, causing the Nile to overflow.
The farmers are very happy, because if the Nile was not really enough, water will be famine. And we have very many famine happened in ancient Egypt. And the Egyptian will suffer from that. But that can indicate a very important evidence that the Nile was the source of Egypt. The Nile was the life for the ancient Egyptian. The Nile was sacred and the most important element for the unification of the 2 lands, Upper and Lower Egypt.
The word for water, when you say agua and gua, all of that is really a word for foot. And so you got to put yourself back in the place of our early ancestors. So we didn't go to jobs, we didn't worry about daycare and 401ks. We was just more fundamentally worried about survival. And so you had to be able to identify things in nature that will allow you to survive versus other things. And so you have 2 types of water when you're out in nature: standing water and running water. And even to this day, When we turn on the faucet or whatnot, we call it running water. We still have it in our psyche to associate it with a concept dealing with the body. The word for foot in run becomes the word for water that you can drink. And so water that flows and runs from the sky, or waters that run through a river and over rocks, that's the water you can drink. But you can't drink the water that is sitting there. And so, this is what they're associating with. And it's the same word for foot that becomes the same word for path, that becomes the same word for business.
During the end of the Middle Kingdom, foreigners from the east came in and settled in the Delta region and seized control of Egypt. They didn't control all of Egypt, but the Egyptians were obliged to pay a heavy taxation. These people are more commonly referred to today as the Hyksos. For approximately 100 years, the Hyksos controlled the northern part of Egypt until the royal family of the 17th dynasty, located at Deir el-Balas, decided to resist and defeated the Hyksos.
Today, this site is known as Deir el-Balas. However, it is believed that the ancient site was known as the Taaqiy, that which bind the two lands together.
Deir el-Balas is a large site. It stretches about 2 miles or more along the edge of the cultivation. So some of the ancient site may actually be under the modern fields, and we don't know the exact extent of it. But we do know the centerpiece, the main part of the site, was the North Palace, or the Royal Palace. And that was a huge structure in an enclosure wall that covered about 500,000 square feet.
When you take into consideration the size and magnitude of edifices like the pyramids and great temples, it's very difficult to be impressed by other ancient structures. However, the palace at Deir el-Balas was no child's play. It was an architectural marvel of its time. What's even more impressive about this palace is it's one of a few remnants of the remaining dwelling places where we can actually gain a glimpse at their homes. The reason for this is simple. There was little emphasis placed on aspects of this life because the ancients determined it to be temporary. The material mostly used to build their houses were things like mud brick or adobe. In contrast, the monuments dealing with spirituality or the afterlife were built to stand the test of time. In other words, the stones used for these structures were stones like granite, limestone, and sandstone. Notwithstanding, we must underscore the extreme importance of the everyday lives of those that lived at Deir el-Balas, particularly that of the royal family of the 17th dynasty.
At Deir el-Balas, we have evidence of some remarkable rulers from the 17th dynasty, Seqenen-Re Tao, Kamoza, Akhmoza, and queens like Teti Sheri, Akhmoza Nefertari, and Akhotep, who herself is credited with being an incredible military leader. Her son recalled her bravery in putting down rebellions in Upper Egypt.
So the North Palace at Deir el-Balas is built on casement foundations, which are long cells of brickwork that are filled in with rubble and then capped with a layer of mud brick to form a platform. And we see this architecture evolving in the royal tumuli at Kerma, which have the same kind of pattern. So we think that that idea actually comes from Nubia up into Egypt.
If you look closely at the fortress behind us, or the remnants of it, you can see the remains of a site that was once 2 stories high, and it was sheathed in plaster, white plaster that is. This was a part of the fortress that the ancient Egyptians used as outlook and outposts to guard against the Hyksos incursions. Second Ra-Ta was killed in battle. Him leading the first open revolt against the Hyksos died in the skirmish. His son Kamoza then took up the battle, and Amoza after him.
The ancient Egyptians were able to defeat the Hyksos by using a new military device on the battlefield. A very portable, maneuverable, but reliable chariot that was manned by 2 people. One was an archer and one was in charge of the horses. These fast horses that you can still find in Ethiopia today, short horses, allow them to have speed, allowed them to have maneuverability, and the archers were able to deliver deadly blows to the front line of the Hyksos. So much so that they were able to defeat them on battle, and battle after battle, they drove them back into Avaris.
It's very interesting to note that there was also several other groups here with the Kemetiu or the ancient Egyptians during this period.
The Magi were elite warriors from ancient Kush, which we would call the Sudan and Ethiopia today, who became the protectors of the rulers. So they were so dynamic that they were the only protectors of the Nasut Biti, what people call the pharaohs, and the royal family. And they were the magistrate and the judges because they were so just and honorable.
We also know that there was large amounts of Kerman Nubians here by the remains of pottery that were found. This Kerman Nubian group is a very interesting group because during this time, ancient Egypt is also at conflict with Kush. So it's puzzling to find large amounts of Kerman Nubians here at a period of time when the ancient Egyptians was at war with Kush.
To obtain a broader perspective on Egypt's southern neighbors and some of their artistic contributions, we traveled to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston to speak with Dr. Lawrence Berman.
What's distinctive about these vessels, which are mostly handmade, is the band of iridescence that is between the black top and the belly of the vase, which is red. This very fine pottery is a product of the classic Kerma civilization, which was a great and powerful civilization that flourished in northern Sudan. This is the most beautiful, the most expert, the most thin-walled, delicate pottery ever made in the Nile Valley, and it is distinctive to the Kerma civilization.
Kerma, a Nubian city-state situated around the third cataract of the HAPI, the Nile. It comes into existence at around 3000 BCE, which is actually around the same time of ancient Egypt's first dynasty. In this amazing city-state, we see two large structures that today, according to the modern Nubian language, we call Defufa. One Defufa is clearly an administrative structure, while the other seems to be the center of a large burial network. Within that network, we see these royal burials that today we call tumuli. In the tumuli, we see things that seem to be more familiar in ancient Egyptian culture. But in fact, what we are seeing is extensive communication between ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia. When we look at the structure of the tumuli, we see this conical shape. This is likely the origin of the pyramidal shape of the pyramid. So what does this actually mean? It's likely that there was extensive movement, not just south to north, but also north to south. And the ancient Egyptians and the Nubians are actually closer to one people.
The Kamosa stela erected at the Karnak temple informs us of the fact that a messenger sent from the Hyksos king HAPI was intercepted by the troops loyal to King Kamosa. And this letter reveals that the Hyksos king was sending to the king of Kerma for reinforcements, to form an alliance, to squeeze, if you will, the Theban kings from the north by the Hyksos, from the south by the Kerman kings. And yet, we find examples of a Nubian presence at Deir el-Balas, Kerma ware, Nubian pottery, revealing that there was a large population of Kerma Nubians at Deir el-Balas with the 17th dynasty kings.
We also know, by reading the Kamosa stela, that Kamosa was fighting incursions into Kush at the same time he was fighting the battle against the Hyksos. This also leads us to believe that there were other people that came into Kerma or came into the Middle Nile region during this period and pushed the people from Kerma out and brought them here to Egypt.
This leads us to wonder what happened in Kerma, because the intercepted letter reveals that HAPI was writing to the new king in Kerma, indicating that there might have been a change of power, a new population ruling in Kerma.
One of the more remarkable things that happened at Deir el-Balas is the unification of the various African nations and African people. You had the Magi, you had the people from Kerma, you had people from Malveaux, you had all these people coming together to form Pan-African unity or Taaqiy. Among these groups, because of their warriorship, helped unify to kick the Hyksos out of ancient Kemet. They commemorized these great warriors with the crown called the Kapres crown. And the Kapres crown, also called the blue crown, was their war crown. And the little circles you see on that crown represent the hair of these great Africans. The word nap is actually the word for hair in the Medu Neter.
It's very clear that our generic use of the term Nubian doesn't map onto what the Egyptians understood of the people with whom they were interacting. In the Old Kingdom, Harkuf makes it clear that there are three separate populations, Wawat, Yurchet, and Yam, that he was dealing with, some of whom were friendly and receptive, and some of whom were belligerent toward the Egyptians. This same more nuanced understanding of the Nubian population is reflected in the temple inscriptions. The earlier set of Nubian nome inscriptions was left under the name of Ptolemy II, and he describes specific areas of Nubia in terms of the populations that live there and the produce of that particular region that would be brought to the temple as donation. This same tradition continues under Ptolemy VI, who also has a Nubian nome list in Philae, again elucidating a specific area associated with a specific group and that specific produce that would be brought to the temple as donation. And so this generic name of Nubian doesn't map onto the Egyptians' understanding of the people with whom they were dealing. There were unique tribes associated with unique areas, and the Egyptians understood this very well.
The word or term Nubia to describe a level of pigmentation, race, or ethnicity is misleading, and it disrupts our understanding of the various peoples that lived along the HAPI River. In search of further evidence of this period, our team traveled south from Deir el-Balas to El-Kab, or the ancient city of Nekeb, to visit the tombs of two very prominent individuals. Our first stop is at the tomb of Sobeknat, the governor of this region during the 17th dynasty. This tomb is closed to the public, but our team was granted unprecedented access.
In our effort to understand or to search the role of economics played in the development of civilization, we came here to modern-day El-Kab, or ancient Nekeb, and we're here at a tomb by a man known as Sobeknat. The reason why this tomb is so important because it was just recently excavated. As you can see here, a lot of the inscriptions are still not completely refined. However, there were some that we just discovered that tells a story. It tells a tale of how ancient Egypt was being invaded from people from the south. Some may translate this as attacks by Nubians. However, when you read deeply or you look deeper, there's a deeper connection there, and it connects it directly to Sejed Fatawi, what was going on during the time of the Hyksos. It's very important to note that this details an attack of people from the south, which is a confederation of tribes that came in from the west and settled in the Middle Nile region. But this is after they attacked Kerma, because as we know, there were large amounts of Kerman Nubians in Sejed Fatawi. So that group that came in from the west pushed those people out, took over their homeland, and now they was bent on attacking the southern front of Egypt. These people were fighting for something. They were fighting for something that we're still fighting for today: economic dominance.
These rock-cut tombs in El-Kab were the resting places for some of Egypt's greatest and most notable nobility.
There aren't many records that have survived throughout the years regarding the battle against the Hyksos. But this tomb here in El-Kab, ancient Nekeb, tells the story, or tells the tale of how it occurred. Ahmo, son of Abana, one of the great military leaders during Kemet's second intermediate period. He rose throughout the ranks and became known as the warrior of the ruler towards the twilight of his career. It's very interesting as we go through this tomb and we look at the hieroglyphics on the Medu Neter on the wall, and it details the account of the battle of Avaris, and it tells you how Avaris fell. We can see here how Ahmo, son of Abana, served under the rulership of King Onusubeti Ahmoset during his early military campaign. On the walls, we can see also that in his later, towards the end of his military campaign, he served under the rulership now of Thutmose I. This is a very important piece of history because it speaks directly to their battles of Sajed Fatawi and how they were connected and how after the war, the Hyksos, they went south and now they invaded Nubia. All these pieces are important parts of history, have everything to do with the economics of the Nile during that time. The battle against Kerma was essential because it regained the trade routes in and out of Central Africa into Punt, where they were able to get goods in and out of the continent. So the important thing to understand is that economics played a key role in the development of civilization during this period.
Egypt's third golden age saw an empire that now stretched from deep within the Sudan into the far points of Asia Minor. For the next 400 years, the unified kingdom of the Nile experienced an economic boom through trade and commerce. Evidence of this can be found at the illustrious mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut, located on the west bank of the Nile in the modern-day city of Luxor.
As the sixth ruler of the 18th dynasty, Queen Hatshepsut inherited a throne that flourished in trade and commerce.
Queen Hatshepsut is also known for her incredible expedition that she sent to the land of Punt, where she conducted a trade expedition to bring back gold, incense. She even brought back the trees so they could grow the incense here in Egypt, exotic animals from deeper in Africa. And she depicts all of this in her funerary temple at Deir el-Bakhri.
The first trade expedition we have on record to Punt was in the 5th dynasty. Again, there was another trade expedition to Punt around the 11th dynasty with Mentuhotep.
As we travel up south, that's where the source of the Nile is coming down north. So up south is going against the flow of the Nile into the highlands. This is the highlands. We have this area called Ta-Netcha, means land of divinity. And one of the famous nations there is Punt. And Punt has had a long relationship with ancient Kemet. The Kemet-U say that they even have part of their origins from Punt.
You can see the sail ships leaving Kemet, sailing down the Red Sea towards Somalia, where Punt was. Reason why we know Punt was in Somalia, because you can see the various different kinds of fish that were only in the Red Sea. The ancient Egyptians put this type of detail into the carvings to show exactly where they were. Now, once they arrived to Punt, you can also see the dignitaries from both sides greeting each other with their trade goods. This is very important because this shows the importance of economics in that time. Queen Ati is here with her dignitaries, meeting the officials from ancient Egypt.
Hatshepsut Aman, one of her most famous titles is Queen Mother, or Hemet Nesut Weret, the Great Royal Mother. It held a lot of power. It actually almost rivaled the power of the Nesut Biti.
For Queen Hatshepsut, the knowledge of her family lineage was essential. She descended from incredibly strong queens before her, Akhmosa Nefertari, Teti Sheri, Akhotep, each of which had served as God's wives of Amun. They were also acknowledged as mother of the king, and so they served a powerful function as a queen mother.
One of the great mysteries surrounding this temple is the chiseled out reliefs of Hatshepsut, as you can see here. Most scholars believe that this occurred by King Thutmose III, who was her nephew and also her stepson. They believe he was enraged by her action to take the throne, that when he became king, he wanted to erase her memory.
Thutmose I was the fourth ruler of Egypt's 18th dynasty. He was succeeded by his son, Thutmose II, who had two wives. One was Auset, who was the mother of Thutmose III, and the other was Queen Hatshepsut, who was his sister. After the untimely death of Thutmose II, Queen Hatshepsut stepped in and assumed the role of a co-regent alongside her young nephew until he, Thutmose III, became of age and was able to rule by himself.
We want to erase the myth that Jhutyms III, Thutmose III, had problems with his aunt and tried to deface all of her temples. She was his Jegna, not only a person who helped him, guided him, And there's this great respect among elders, and he kept that. And that's why he built his temple, his mortuary temple, right next to hers.
Thutmose III made Egypt an empire. He became, over time, the greatest warrior king of Egypt, because not only did he subdue the south, but he then subdued all of Asia Minor up to almost to the Black Sea.
Once of age, Thutmose III returned to Egypt from his many battles in Asia and inherited the throne as the sole ruler. There is no record of contention between Thutmose III and his aunt, Queen Hatshepsut. As co-regents, they shared the responsibility of governing, particularly while he was away securing Egypt's borders. Upon his return, there was a peaceful transition of rulership. The question shouldn't be who defaced the monuments, but why. This mystery may never be solved, but what is known is that the ancient Egyptians saw their sacred writing, or Medu Neche, commonly called hieroglyphics, as words of power with invocation properties.
So if you look at the walls of Hatshepsut Amon's mortuary temple, you will see why things had to be changed, because it was contrary to the popular belief of Ma'at in ancient Kemet.
In the early 18th dynasty, we see a strong emphasis on tracing the lineage through the female line, so that the king becomes a king by marrying the daughter of a king. The king traces his lineage through his mother's line, and in fact, this tradition is enshrined in the myth of Osiris and Isis. Osiris becomes king by marrying Isis, and she is the throne upon which he sits.
The masculine energy that the Greeks call Horus was actually Heru. And Heru, symbolic of higher consciousness, a powerful male energy. And we have to understand that Heru, all of the rulers of ancient Kemet looked at themselves as Shemsu Heru, followers of Heru, this tremendous power. Remember, the falcon flies higher than any bird, just one of the strongest, is symbolic of power and might. And so now, the first name of every ruler was, first of all, his Heru name, Heru Ren. Then he went into his Nebti Ren, the two ladies. Then he went into his golden Heru name, which means that he lived forever, never tarnished like gold. Then he had two names inside of a Shin, his Nasut Biti Ru, which is ruler of Upper and Lower Kemet, and then he had Sa-Ra, which means the son of Ra.
One might ask, if Egypt is such a matrilineal society, why we don't see more sole-ruling queens. The myth of Osiris and Isis illustrates for us that Osiris becomes king by marrying Isis, and yet it is her son, Horus, who is to follow his father Osiris on the throne, making clear that the ruler is understood to be male.
Another example of Heru, this warrior energy, talks about the power of Heru, higher consciousness, but also the warrior aspect. Remember, the falcon Heru has no rivalry in the sky. It's the fastest creature on the planet. Jhutyms, Thutmose III, wanted you to think he had this type of power. And so, therefore, he was a Shemsu Heru. His war tactics were impeccable. In fact, he was undefeated in battle. Even before he became the Nasut Biti, he had won over 20 victorious battles. So we need to put things in proper perspective. Even today, places like West Point and military commanders study the tactics of Jhutyms III, Thutmose III.
Much of ancient Egypt's spiritual system and culture is deeply rooted in African philosophy. Studying the philosophical and cultural correlations between the various African groups can be the key to unraveling the mysteries of ancient Egypt.
In ancient Egypt, ancient Kemet, throughout African thought, as I understand it and read it, our understanding of being human was to be divine, to be spirit. And so then if we are divine beings walking the earth, how we then acquire those resources that advance our divinity, that affirm our goodness, our righteousness, becomes the grounding or the foundation for the economic exchange.
Can economics be looked at in a spiritual context? The principles of exchange are far greater than something like, I'll give you $1 for 3 lemons. Since the beginning of time, human beings have seen their relationship with the divine in an economic format. Our daily prayers, supplications, and offerings are all examples of an exchange between ourselves and the divine.
We're here in the temple of Ameride. She was inducted into a sacred order known as the God's wife of Amen. And she's depicted and portrayed here on the same apparatus and the same scale as Annette Heru. You can also see by the clear depiction that she's making offerings and the offerings are being accepted.
When we speak of spiritual economics or the concept of ma'at, we're speaking about the fundamental principle of reciprocity. The ancient Egyptians were advocates of executing the principles of truth, justice, righteousness, harmony, and balance. This outlook laid the cornerstone for other African spiritual traditions like Ifa.
Nangareo, nangareo. The ceremony that you see here before you is a ceremony about Nangare. Nangare is a ceremony that is representative of the 16 mounds of Ifa. It's out of the Odu, which we call Otura Meiji.
What is it that you offer? What is it that you bring to the table? And a lot of times when people have a poor connection with what it is that they interface with life, or they haven't had a sufficient connection to the gods, ergo their offerings, it's not always a physical offering. A lot of times it is your connection to them. How do you connect with the higher forces beyond yourself?
We clearly see how these two African traditions deal with the importance of giving offerings, an emphasis on good character, as well as understanding the divine through its various principles. Ramses III was the last great ruler of Egypt's third golden age. After this period, Egypt would fall into its third intermediate period, a time that the Egyptians witnessed countless waves of invasions, some more brutal than the others. To escape this brutality, scores of people began to flee and migrate west and south to their ancestral homelands.
We're standing here in modern-day Luxor, right across from the Luxor Temple, or the Shemet Ipet. And what makes this temple so significant, because unlike any other Egyptian temple, it's orientated north to south as opposed to the regular east to west. And why is this important? This is important because the ancient Egyptians were telling you about their origins and where they derived. Some may debate this, but we also can find evidence of this within the culture, within the language. When we look to the west, we have the word Amentet. Consequently, or along with that, the word Amenti is right. The only way that happens is if you're orientated north to south, as we are right now. We're along the Nile, on the Corniche, and we're facing south. My right hand is facing the west. Consequently, my left hand is facing east, or Yabet T. This only happens if you orientate yourself north to south.
Up south. Up south, Rashi is depicting the origins of where their ancestors come from. The highlands, the interior of Africa. So there's a reference there. They usually refer to this with the soot plant. And the soot plant is a divine plant. It takes precedence just in honorific ordering. That's why the word the soot plant is written first. Okay, the soot plant was a source of energy. It was a vital plant that could be eaten. It was used for many things, but it represents a symbol of divinity. Up south, because that's where the soot plant grows. There's still evidence of the power of the South in the Quastel incense burner. It makes reference of the whole Nasut-Biti royal family, the royal trilogy being set in place before even ancient Kemet came into existence.
The first dynasty. The object itself was the first object found in that tomb. The subject represented here is a procession that goes toward this palace facade here, shown in panels. And It's clear from the representation of the white crown there that it held a pharaonic ruler, that is a king. And in front of him, just to make it sure, is a falcon, which was probably sitting on a little seraph or palace facade like that one.
The Custal incense burner was discovered in a tomb in a place called Custal, which is near the Sudan-Egypt border. The object itself has several aspects of what we know to be Egyptian culture prior to the onset of ancient Egypt, proving that the civilization along the Nile developed in the south and moved north.
If you examine it further on the Custal incense burner, you'll see the ruler wearing the white crown, the hedge crown, which was symbolic of power. And throughout Africa, this crown had been used. You can see it going all far as the Nuk culture and Ifa. They're wearing the white crown. We see in Kerma, King Neja in the 1700s is wearing the white crown. So this was kind of synonymous with power in ancient Kemet. It kind of distinguished the Nasut Biti. So the Nasut part was ruler from the south, which was the white crown, and the Biti part was the red crown from the north. And together they represented the Nasut Biti, ruler of Upper and Lower Kemet.
The concept of the king being an aspect of the divine was just one of the many aspects of the cultural confluence the Africans shared as people migrated throughout the continent.
One extraordinary thing about migrations and the migration from the east to the west in Africa, what it afforded was information flow. So the people who were in the early migrations knew what resources was in the east, and now they were able to take the resources of the west and begin to put together trade relationships with the east. And so you'll find if you go to where Napta-Playa, which is an area in southern Kemet, southern Egypt today, near the Chad and the Sudan border. And a lot of the things they found there, the seeds, the rock painting of the types of cattle and stuff that was being domesticated, you can see much of that came from the West. And so you know then there was a relationship, and that relationship more likely was a trade relationship.
Initially, I mean, people traded, and they traded goods and services, and when they didn't have necessarily the things that they wanted to trade, they developed a currency. Cowrie shells on the African continent, other tokens.
You have populations moving, and our system, we came up with a system, the first money in the world. In Ghana, they call it, the word is cedis. We call it over here cowries. The cowrie shells was our first money. Long before the Romans had money or the Greeks had money, we had money, and it was these cowrie shells. And so you only have money if you have a trading system, if you have a system where you're buying some products from someone else. And so you can find those cowrie shells in East Africa, Central Africa, and West Africa. So that lets you know that those people had a relationship, because the same type of cowrie shells was found in many places.
West Africa does have a direct link to the HAPI Valley. And we know that linguistically, first of all, starting with the work of Dr. Diop, we see that many West African languages are related linguistically to Medu Necher. Another thing, many West African nations, the Wolof, for example, the Yoruba, another group, have actually traced their heritage going back to Kemet. So at the fall of Kemet, the people dispersed throughout Africa, throughout the continent. They went south and they went west and developed new cultures and new civilizations.
The Yoruba deity Ogun and the ancient Egyptian deity Ra are connected via linguistics. They both come from a root meaning fire in both languages. And the phonemes correspond regularly when we compare the languages. So the ancient Egyptian R corresponds to Yoruba G and K. And what we transliterate as lowercase a in the ancient Egyptian actually corresponds to the N sound in the Yoruba language.
In the diffusion of cultures, we find that there's a symbol that's very, very prominent, and that is the Akwaba and the Ankh, the comparison of the two. And the earliest Akwaba that we know of comes from South Africa. The petroglyphs, some of the people say are 200,000 BC. So with that Ankh, we see a kind of circle that's radiating. The Ankh is within the solar disk. It's very, very interesting that the solar disk is compared, and also what seems like the horizon. It's a longer horizon line, so that the sun rising and setting is somehow associated with the vital energy, the vital force that we find in the Ankh in ancient Egypt, and the Ankh that we find called the Akwaba doll in West Africa.
In our journey thus far, we've witnessed examples of cultural confluence between East and West Africa, establishing proof that they are in fact the same people. Let's now fast forward in time to the 10th century AD, where we see the emergence of several West African kingdoms that flourished economically with the trans-Saharan trade. This network of trade stretched across North Africa, throughout the Mediterranean, and into Western Asia. The items traded were gold, salt, and even people. The mineral wealth traded across North Africa became the beacon that attracted Arabs and eventually Europeans to North and West Africa, and leads eventually to the transatlantic slave trade and the economic foundation of Western civilization.
Let's think about culture in West Africa. Culture is the key to understanding African civilization, because culture is the university. See, culture is not the dancing, it's not the clothing, it's not the music. The music, the dancing, the clothing, those are tools of culture. Culture are the ideas, principles, and concepts that the clothing, the drumming, the dancing is trying to convey. And that's what makes culture so significant and so important. Even the way the chief sits, the way the chief or queen mother is greeted, the type of rhythm that's played when you're greeting a chief versus the type of rhythm that is played when someone is dancing. The type of cloth that a chief is wearing and a queen mother is wearing, or the color of a cloth that the general public. Gray cloth means commemoration to ancestors. Black and red cloth means a funeral, our representation. Gold cloth means we're dealing with royalty. Certain patterns on the cloth that we call the kente cloth is making reference to a certain royal family. Each royal family have their own kente design, or you might want to even call it kente hieroglyph. And so culture is the place where people get informed and instructed about their ancestors. And when we see dances, like some of the dances you'll see in here, which is called the Oduwa, this is a court dance, a very significant dance that speaks to royalty and ancestry. And one good aspect of culture is pilgrimage, as we will see our people go every year to a place called Sinmenso, where a river which is called Dankrosum, the slave river, is, where our people took their last bath before going into the slave dungeons. And buried at that river is the body of two enslaved Africans, one from Jamaica and one from North America, to symbolize the return of the ancestors to home. Go from the slave river into the slave dungeons. And we are in those dungeons until we get on the slave ships and we never see our Africa again.
We all know it as a fact that in 1471 was the first time the Portuguese came over here. They came in here initially to trade. And the system of trade at the time was the barter system. So then they were giving out goods for goods.
There was no African role in relationship to the enslavement process being planned and laid out in Europe. But there was a major role of African enslavement on the continent, because Africans had to be induced to have conflicts with each other to produce captives that became those who went into the holds of the ships. And in order to do that, the European devised all types of mechanisms to induce the Africans to become involved in wars to produce prisoners. Africa had no need for slave labor because everybody in Africa worked and labored, including the chiefs and important people. But the Europeans were able to entice the Africans with jewelry, mirrors, woven cloth, velvets, and even more important, with firewater.
1482, that's 11 years after the Portuguese had first come in, led by their captain called Don Diego de Azambuja. They came to see the chief of the town called Nana Kwamina Ansa. They negotiated for this plot of land and they had the structure put up. It's on record that the chief was hesitant in giving out the land, citing cultural differences to be a problem in the future. In fact, he went further to suggest that friends will be better friends if they don't live together. But upon persuasions and assurances, he gave in. And thus became the first time in the history of the world a West African chief legally transferring a title to a plot of land to an European.
The Dutch have a relationship militarily with the Elmina people. And the British have a relationship with the Fanti people. And so wars between the Ashanti and the Fanti, for example, would be taking place. And the captives of the Ashanti captives would be taken to the English fort where the Fanti had a relationship. And the capture of the Fanti people will be taken 10 miles to the Dutch fort. And this thing went on for hundreds of years.
You must also understand that slavery in itself, one form or another, had been with all the races in the time past. And for that reason, the Africans in themselves had an idea before the foreigners came. But in how it was structured in our culture was not the same as they introduced later on. If the person over here that will be seen as a slave long before the foreigners came, to a greater extent ought to be seen as a servant. Because in most cases, that person had rights. He could marry, raise free kids, acquire properties, pay the price when he said he'd be a free person.
If we don't take care of teaching our children and our families of our real history and heritage, nobody will. Not only they will not teach it, but they will distort it. And more than distort it, they will change it to levels that you will never recognize, that we were never slaves, we were enslaved people. And there's a big difference being enslaved to being a slave. Because the people who came or who were brought forcibly from Africa were teachers, were entrepreneurs, were scientists, were researchers, were sociologists. They were people with all the civil and human rights that you could imagine. which violently were forced to infrahuman conditions, abuse, and exploitation.
The term slavery does not refer to African peoples. It actually refers to the Slavic peoples. And who were the Slavic peoples? They were the people in Central and Southern Europe. Slavic peoples, Russian, Slavic peoples, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. These were folks that were not Christian, and they had their traditional religions, and you could call them pagans. And so, before there was the transatlantic slave trade in the 1400s, you had 400 to 500 years of the white slave trade, in which the people that were involved were white folks from Central Europe that were not Catholics, so there were no allegiance from Spain and Portugal and Italy to them, and they sold them into slavery in the Arab world.
We're standing in the Elmina slave dungeon, and I'm looking to my right at the Portuguese church in the middle of a slave dungeon where you're committing the world's greatest genocide, where you're putting people to death, where you're raping women and little girls, where you're selling people into bondage for the rest of their life, to take away their language, their culture, and their history. They have a church on top of the slave market.
Power is the ability to define reality and to have other people respond to your definition as if it were their own. If I can use that definition to segue to this question, this sort of haunting question about economy in relation to God, that who defines the meaning of God also defines the relationship between economy and God.
What role did religion play in the development of the slave trade, and when did this occur?
In the 1400s and the 1500s, blessed by the Pope, who divided up the world and gave half of it to Spain and half of it to Portugal. That whole understanding of how the church wanting to get into the power of politics and the money that was emerging divided up the world from North Pole to South Pole.
On the first floors where they were auctioning the enslaved, captured Africans off. And on the second level is where they're having their church and praising their God.
The emergence of a system of managing economics, politics, and culture that became capitalism, became the vehicle and the engine for the emergence of this modern European state structure. The wealth and the movement around the world became such that the joint stock companies that we all have a little sentimental thing about, but not understanding that that's the political economic instrument that was used to establish the European world dominance that we now have. And so when we say the Dutch West Indian Company, or the Danish Company, or the English Slaving Company, or the French, that instrument to manage this new economics becomes key and crucial for us to understand.
Our journey continues now from West Africa across the Atlantic Ocean to America. Let's start in the early 1600s with the appearance of the first European colonies in North America and see what role race played in the economic and political development of North America.
We know that as a matter of our legal records, there is no reference to a group of humanity called white people prior to 1681. So people with low levels of melanin, with skin as light as mine, did they exist before 1681? Of course they did. But they weren't called white people. In the legal record in colonial North America, we find that they were referenced as British and other Christians, British and other freeborns, or by one's ethnic origin, the Scot, the Irish, the Dutch, but never were they called white people. White people doesn't appear as a reference to a group of humanity in law anywhere on the planet until 1681 in the colony of Maryland.
They had to create something in the mind of the poor whites that distinguished them and separated them from the blacks. And that's where you developed what I call, and James Baldwin called, the religion of whiteness. Because until then, all the different white people were remembered as where they were from. But then they realized that they can give them a new badge of honor. They could give them a new passport. And that passport of whiteness would then give them some social mobility. And, you know, you have to think about the history of all these people who come here from Europe. They're coming from class societies where you cannot get up in a society unless you're a member of a particular families. And if you weren't, then you and your children are going to live and die in the same position.
So what helps us to understand this emergence of an entirely new group of humanity called white people is a massive rebellion called Bacon's Rebellion. This occurred in 1676 and was led by a man named Nathaniel Bacon. Now, a number of things converged to cause this rebellion to be as enormous as it was. They include the fact that tobacco prices had dropped, available land for folks to purchase was very narrowed, very limited, because the king gave most of it to his friends. Taxes increased from the crown in England. And so things had become very harsh for the workers in colonial North America. For example, for relatively minor infractions by indentured servants, they imposed really lengthy additions to their terms of service. So Nathaniel Bacon did not have to look very hard to find disgruntled, both indentured, enslaved, and free persons to join his challenge of the ruling elite, because this was the big picture. Basically, the 99% within these colonies, the workers, were finding it harder and harder to make it. And at the same time, the ruling elite, what we would refer to today as the 1%, were doing extremely well.
In the 1600s and 1700s, America sets up a corporate state. The U.S. government they're not interested in kings and queens and nobles. These were commercial entrepreneurs, slave owners who had land and resources on the land and Africans to work the land. And they set up a corporate structure called the U.S. government.
It was the chance for a small group of wealthy investors to take a risk for the opportunity for significant gain of wealth. The United States formed heavily tied to corporate interests, and that those are the interests that helped to give rise to the nation. From its founding, those are the interests, i.e. property interests, that this country called the United States of America was set up to protect.
The Dutch settlers living in New York, or what they called at that time New Amsterdam, built a wall in Lower Manhattan. This occurred in the early 1600s, and thus this is where we get the name or term Wall Street. In 1626, enslaved Africans were brought to Manhattan, but it was not until December 13th, 1711, that the New York City Common Council made Wall Street the city's first official slave market for the sale and rental of enslaved Africans. At the corner of Wall and Pearl Streets, this slave market operated from 1711 to 1762. Today, Wall Street acts as a worldwide economic epicenter, and as a result, New York City has been called both the most economically powerful city and the leading financial center in the world.
Wall Street is the cornerstone of American economic commerce. So if you want to talk about slavery and the trading of slaves as a way to build wealth, then Wall Street is where it all starts, because that's where money became a financial asset, and that's where American economic commerce began.
If we look at origins of enslavement and the extent to which enslavement became a foundation of our nation's economic system, because you have mortgages on people and you had insurance on people. And this became the collateral that people used to expand their businesses.
Slavery has to be seen as a four-way profit system. Profits made in fitting out the joint stock companies. Every European country became a part of the joint stock trading companies. That's a model developed initially by the Portuguese, but perfected by the Dutch. We have to see the interconnection between the production of goods that service this new global economy.
The origins of several major banks and other major corporations within this country and Europe have their genesis tied to the transatlantic slave trade. It's from this commercial enterprise that these companies spawned and grew into the current economic system we see today. As our march in time continues, we see much of the financial interactions that take place for these companies and others is by way of Wall Street, in the form of the buying and trading of stocks.
I mean, Wall Street is pretty much a stock exchange. It's where stock are traded. Stock, of course, are the parts of a company that are traded. So companies, essentially, in order to raise capital, sell stock. When market conditions fluctuate, stock is more highly or less highly valued. And as stock is less and more highly valued, people choose to trade that stock. Apple stock would be a great example in terms of the conditions that have made that a very hot stock. And seeing it basically, it split a few years ago, like 7-1 or something like that, which meant one stock then became 7 stock. But Wall Street is, even though it's a physical place where much trading is done, it's also a term that really, when people talk about Wall Street, they're really talking about corporate dealings with financial trading.
There is a connection between Wall Street and white supremacy because there's a connection between and I want people to really hear this, there is a connection between every institution grown out of this country and white supremacy. Every one of them. It was built with the idea of white people as superior, the nation as a whole, including its laws and its institutions.
There's a long history of the United States government and certain laws passed by Congress that has fostered the furtherance of white superiority. These laws passed not only marginalized other communities, but they also acted as economic roadblocks that prevented blacks
society. And so if you think about some of the things that have happened in this country, you go back to the political policies that have been put in place that allows for commerce to happen. And it's one of the reasons you find such power in the Secretary of Treasury, such power in the Secretary of Commerce, because those policies actually translate in how business happens in this country.
What is capitalism?
Capitalism is the elevation of capital over other factors of production. So the capital has a precedence over land and labor and entrepreneurial ability. Those who have the capital, the dollars, are the ones who are essentially ruling the system.
Capitalism is a system in America that's pretty much driven by one important rule. The rule is that the company manager's number one job is to maximize shareholder wealth. So in a lot of ways, you can say the capitalist system is like a horse and jockey system. If you think about a horse and jockey, the horse does all the work and the jockey gets all the credit. The horse is the one running around the track in the mud, and the jockey's the one who gets all the money if the race is won. Well, in a capitalist system, the jockeys, the people who get all the benefits from capitalism, tend to be the people who own assets. The investors, the business owners, the owners of real estate, those are the jockeys. Well, who are the horses? Well, the horses are the people who put money into the jockeys' pockets.
America is run by industrial complexes. An industrial complex is that relationship between the politician and the corporate CEO. Wall Street and Washington.
Predatory capitalism is about always looking at where you extract surplus value from. In a society that elevates predatory capitalism, there's never any such thing as enough. You always want more. You got profit, you want more profit. All these things, our stock market, our profit centers, all based on, can I get more profit?
Should the consumer take responsibility and take a stance against super profits and stand up to greed? How much power does the average person have to prevent the exploitation of people? What would happen if people refused to buy that phone for $1,000 that took about $25 to make? What would happen if people stopped feeding into super capitalism?
You know, the question becomes, how do you modulate the greed? How do you contain the greed? And I think that one of the ways that we contain greed is through the use of religion. I mean, religion essentially recognizes the moral value in us. And if we look at the Bible properly, I've been working on some things around economic justice and the Bible. If we look at the Bible properly, it talks about the least and the left out. It talks about, you know, when God said, whatever you do to the least of these, you also do to me. When people had slammed the door in the face of the homeless person and refused to feed the hungry person and all of that. And so religion plays some role. But, you know, we're much less religious than we used to be. And the other thing is that religion has often always been used to justify predatory capitalism.
There is a connection between God and money, particularly among African people in the United States of America, where we have confused and confounded the variables, where we begin to associate money with being godlike and the lack of money with not being godlike. We have a system that preaches prosperity ministry, which means that if you follow our tenets, you're going to accumulate wealth in addition to being blessed. And if you don't follow our tenets, then you will be poor and as such unblessed. And so that confounding of those variables keeps people confused and away from the construct of spirituality.
In the early 1900s, there emerged several independent and self-sustainable Black communities. One in particular was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This utopia for Blacks was one of the places coined Black Wall Street because of the amount of wealth in such a relatively small area. There were several grocery stores, schools, jewelry shops, law and doctor practices, banks, and even a hospital, all Black-owned. The people of the community managed to keep the wealth in the city. That is, until May 31st, 1921, when white mobs descended onto the town, shooting people and burning down the town. Is it possible to create these types of communities today?
Give me a Black community. I'd love living around Black people. I think integration hurt us. 'Cause, you know, when you look at the Bible properly, it talks about the least and the left out. It talks about, you know, when God said, whatever you do to the least of these, you also do to me. When people had slammed the door in the face of the homeless person and refused to feed the hungry person and all of that. And so religion plays some role. But, you know, we're much less religious than we used to be. And the other thing is that religion has often always been used to justify predatory capitalism.
tremendously. Remember, since we're talking about economic development and America dividing, this is gonna sound crazy to you, but I'm gonna say it anyway. Segregation helped. It really did. Remember Black Wall Street? Tulsa? The reason why Tulsa was so successful, we're talking about black people who owned oil wells in Tulsa, produced thousands of barrels a day. They owned the land, they owned the businesses, they had their own schools because they had to, because of segregation. They weren't allowed to live in white communities. They weren't allowed to live, go to white schools or use white hospitals. So they had to come together.
The importance of vibrant and healthy black communities cannot be overstated, neither can nor should the entities within those communities that are the cornerstone for growth, such as schools, businesses, and other institutions. The theory today is that there is a lack of support within the black community, and as a result, there is a failure to move forward as communities.
So when I think about the current state of the African American controlled banks, I have to put it in perspective. Today, there's approximately 5,700 banks inside of the United States. Now, that does not include credit unions. There are currently only 22 that are African American controlled. If you go back over the last 10, 15 years, there were approximately 48. So today, we've seen kind of the dwindling of African American banks. Why is that important? It is important because we need to be sure that people understand the plight of these institutions and that the loss of those institutions makes it very challenging to see reinvestment in communities that are dear to us. And so I am hopeful, as now chairman of the National Bankers Association, we can, one, elevate this issue such that people understand that there is a need for deposits in those communities that allow for lending in those communities, that allow for job creation in those communities, such that when you think about the wealth gap based on race or age or culture, there's an effort to begin to close that gap. And if we don't begin to talk about those and educate others about these gaps, then we can't expect them to close. But it is our responsibility to be sure that people are educated and informed on the wealth gap in America and how that translates into our institutions' existence.
To have consciousness or to be aware without resources is a tragedy. And to have resources without consciousness or awareness is also a tragedy. We need both strategy and finances to be progressive.
Okay, let me be inelegant and quote Lauryn Hill. It's not what you cop, it's what you keep. What you cop is money and what you keep is wealth. We talk a lot about money and income, but the fact is that wealth is intergenerational. Wealth is what you have. It's not what you spend, it's what you have. So a lot of our work about the U.S. economy and African American people has often focused on income, and African Americans on average have about 60% of the income that whites have. Although if you go by occupation, it may be, it may be higher in some occupations. A black MBA is going to make about 90% of what a white MBA makes. But on average, African Americans earn about 60% of what whites earn. But the wealth piece is very different. We have African American people, 12% of the U.S. population have about 2% of U.S. wealth. So many of us have negative wealth.
So when you think about wealth, there are a lot of ways to look at getting wealth or creating wealth. And one of the ways that we can do a better job of creating wealth is self-sacrifice and creating protection for our families. At a point in time, you have to ask yourself, life insurance is actually the ability to protect your family in the event of your demise. And so while it is a selfless act, it is the ability to create wealth for your family and protection for them from a financial perspective. We see it happen quite often in other cultures. And the reality is, for someone young, having a term life insurance policy of $50,000 or $100,000 or $500,000 or $1 million can make the difference in your family's upward trajectory from a wealth perspective at a very small cost over the period of your life.
What role has the United States government played in the development of rich and poor neighborhoods?
So federal lending policies created white suburbs and And then the flip side of that coin was black ghettos in our urban centers.
The way that economics is impacted by migration of blacks in and out of cities like Detroit, Chicago, and even New York, is that once we come into a city, then a lot of the federal government resources leave. So they create these, in the 60s we used to call them ghettos. I'll just say now, capitalism creates impoverished black and brown communities, I think deliberately, by removing economic opportunities, no longer investing economically in the infrastructure of those cities. If you traveled around this country and saw how many of our cities, I just came from St. Louis, and so many abandoned buildings. You don't even have to go all the way to St. Louis. You can go to a lot of places in New York and see abandoned buildings. And you can go down to Chicago, to Detroit, especially Detroit, and you see abandoned infrastructure. Chokwe Lumumba, who, may he rest in peace, he was a mayor for a short while in Jackson, Mississippi. Infrastructure, abandoned buildings. So capitalism abandons communities once we get in these communities. And then the economics of that community is lowered and the people are impoverished. Now they want to come back to those communities that they once had. And people call it gentrification. I call it ethnic cleansing.
So these beliefs about white as safe, as coming with economic value, helps us to see the link between gentrification and the white superiority that created those perceptions in the first place. I don't know what we can talk about in this nation without talking about white superiority, honestly. It's so foundational to a basic way of thinking that has shaped law, policy, institution, from day one up to the present.
Tamir Rice, Sean Bell, Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, and Michael Brown, just to name a few. All victims of police brutality. Is this a form of bullying? And what steps can be taken to make it stop?
Economic bullying is driven largely by the disparity in wealth in America. What's interesting, though, about that bullying is that the biggest thing a bully can steal from you is your will to fight back. If the bully frightens you and makes you timid and it takes away your ability to believe in yourself, then the bullying is very, very easy. He doesn't even need to actually beat you up anymore. All he has to do is look at you. So what's happened with black folks isn't just that our wealth was stolen from us and our resources and assets, and we've been blocked away from certain ideas and education. But what's also been stolen from us is our desire and our ability to fight back, and our willingness to trust one another well enough to collude and work together to fight back in a unified fashion.
I was a Chicago police officer for a few years, and people often say to me, okay, Badalora, so what's going on with the police with all these shootings of unarmed black men? And I always say back to my largely white crowds, look, how many of you who, when you get in that elevator and the young black man walks in the elevator with you, are, putting your briefcase to the side, holding your purse back? Whatever belief system going on in you that's causing that sort of reaction, and when you're given the legal authority to use lethal force, and you wear a badge and walk around with a gun, those beliefs that made you in the elevator hold your purse over here or move your briefcase or to feel uncertain, now see those enacted by somebody who's law enforcement.
given that we know that economics and politics are not just siblings, but they're kind of one and the same, that the American political system is pretty much the manifestation of the desires and wishes of the economic system and those who control it, right? So given that we know that the police that answer to the politics of that community are going to be driven by the economics of that community because economics and politics overlap. One of the things about police shootings that's really interesting is that police do not shoot kids in rich neighborhoods unless those kids came from the poor neighborhoods, right? They don't shoot the rich kids. It ain't even about just white and black. They shoot white people, but they tend to shoot poor white people.
And so African people have to begin to say, we have value. And as value, all that is in our domain has value. Africa is the richest continent on this entire planet. And per capita it has more poor people in Africa than anywhere else in the world. Why is that? Because somehow someone put in our minds that the economic engine is driven outside of Africa. Africa is just the cargo ship that drags the wealth. You don't own the wealth. You see what I'm saying? We can exchange our relationship to who we are. That's the first step is who are we? And then as African beings, we then let's talk about the issues of exchange. Let's talk about issues of commerce. Let's talk about issues of even war. Let's talk about issues of development. All those things that are human questions in the modern world have to start with, who am I?
In order to rectify our current socioeconomic situation, we should look at the following solutions.
Both money and time are precious assets. They are both forms of capital that can be invested. Both of them have value. Both of them have economic value. Money is very obvious. Time is not so obvious. A person who loses their job might see themselves as a worthless economic commodity. They can say, I'm broke, I have nothing. But actually, you're very wealthy because you have a lot of time. You have time that somebody else, your boss, was willing to pay money for. So a lot of times what we do is we underestimate our human capital because we think that if we have plenty of time and no money, that means that we're broken. That there's not a broke person in the world who has free time on their hands.
African American people have often viewed the economy like kids with their nose to the window at a candy store. It's been distant from us. I mean, certainly we do the microeconomics of surviving, of living, of paying our bills, of doing all that, of buying our homes or starting our businesses. But the broader economic picture is not often there. And more importantly, all too often, we don't see ourselves as economic actors. So I wrote Surviving and Thriving as a love note to my people because I really wanted Black people, especially young Black people, to understand that we have always been economic actors. Even the very simple act of purchasing yourself is an economic act. You chose then to participate in the economy and to invest in yourself. And you chose to do that. And this is the thing about African American people in the economy, is when we participate with enormous faith.
As Blacks continue to strive to be economic actors, we can see this very interesting and alarming love-hate relationship with those that look to advance white supremacy towards Black people. On one hand, we see examples of high levels of disdain, hatred, translating into what occurred in Tulsa and other Black Wall Street communities. And on the other hand, we see white people secretly loving several aspects of Black culture.
So there is great irony in the chattel enslavement of African people. On one hand, we see one of the most pernicious systems ever perpetrated against human beings. But on the other hand, we continually see the love of African philosophy and African symbols. It plays out greatly when we look at something like the Tekken or the obelisk. The obelisk and the Tekken has been taken all over the world by people who are the perpetrators of enslavement. In fact, the one in New York City, the one in Central Park, was given by the modern provincial government, the Arabic leaders of Egypt, to the United States because they were trying to open up a new cotton market. The global cotton market had nearly collapsed because of the end of African enslavement. And so what are we seeing? we're actually continuing to see the love of African symbols and African philosophy, which even plays out in modern architecture, particularly in a place like New York City.
At first glance, what do you see when you look up at the One World Trade Center? The first thing you notice is the Tekken, a symbol of rebirth, renewal, and resurrection, to bring new again that which had fallen.
The questions that must be asked are, what is the importance of architecture and what role does it play today? The World Trade Center lies at the center of the financial districts of New York City, among some of the country's most important financial institutions, like the New York Stock Exchange, which is the world's largest exchange market. If you take a closer look at One World Trade Center, you can see the outline of 4 obelisks on each side of the building. Chief architect David Childs stated in CBS News that he wanted to design this building like an obelisk to mark the events of September 11th. We also see similar references to One World Trade Center being an obelisk in Architectural Digest and Haber Arts. What's even more interesting is that the site itself reflects the Karnak Temple complex in Egypt. The design and layout of the trees and the 2 pools mirror the Karnak Temple. Similarly, the area between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument in DC also resemble the Karnak Temple with the obelisk in the pool. This is yet another example of how Western civilization has borrowed from the Africans that lived along the HAPI or Nile River. The relevance here is as people of color, we need to know and understand the richness of our history and our culture, so we can translate that into a sustainable movement that does more than just educate us, but also foster support for banks and other institutions in our communities.
We should definitely support Black banks for a few reasons. For one, when we apply for loans at major banks, even if we are qualified, I found that we are shut out of those loans more frequently than those of our white counterparts. And if we get the loans, the interest rates are at a 32% higher rate. So it's very important for us that we support banks that are for us and by us so that we can bypass some of those different biases. There are several banks that we can choose from in our communities to support. There's One United, Citizens Trust Bank, Industrial Bank, and First Independence Bank.
Here at First Independence, one of our core principles is understanding and beginning to try to teach financial literacy such that people can understand it and not feel overwhelmed by it, but understand that managing something as simple as your credit score has an impact on your financial destiny.
What is the importance of cooperative economics in the Black community? And can this be a solution to the plight of the current socio-economic situation facing urban communities?
Economic empowerment is not just about buying and selling. Even though that's what We Buy Black represents, it goes beyond that. So it has to be more than just buying Black, right? We have to rent Black, right? Or we have to own Black and rent Black, and we have to bank Black.
One of the major reasons that the communities should support institutions like ours is to understand the impact of leveraging the dollar to support your community. The banking principle of being able to take in fractional lending, which is take in $10 and lend out $9, was based on the principle that if I loan out that $9 and I allow someone else to go buy a home or to actually become a producer in the society, it creates wealth in that it comes back to the bank such that I can fractionally lend again. Part of the $9 that comes back, I can lend another $10 or $9 against that, moving it forward. And while that sounds like a very complex issue, it is a very simple issue. And so what happens a lot of times, even in urban communities, is dollars are loaned out, but they go to suburban communities, and then you get the transfer of wealth. And so you do not have the ability to produce an income in a way that is circular. And so in many principles you've heard many individuals talk about, in certain Hispanic communities, the dollar spends about 20 days in that community. In the African American community, unfortunately, we hear that's about 6 hours. And so while I am as guilty as many others, the point we're trying to make is if the dollar doesn't circulate in the community, it has no opportunity to create a producer environment such that it gets to multiply, which is why the banking system was developed.
The three things you can do with money are that you can spend the money, you can hold the money, or you can grow the money. Well, obviously spending the money is how a lot of people get into trouble. In fact, they don't just spend all their money, they spend money they don't even have, and they end up in debt. So those are the options that you want to avoid. The options that you want to pursue are to either hold the money or to grow the money, and there are techniques for doing this. So the best way to avoid financial pitfalls is to follow a model that I have for children, which is what I call the KID model. The KID model stands for Knowledge, Investment, Discipline. Knowledge means that every black child in America should have a basic economic education from a very early age. They should know how to buy a home. They should know how to start a business. They should know how to invest in the stock market. So you've got the knowledge now. Now they need capital. That's where the I comes in. That stands for investment. That means that every person of color should invest at least $5 a day into the stock market on a regular basis. Doesn't matter which stocks you buy. What matters is that you just get in the game. Because if you're not in the game, you can't win the game. And so the best way to be a bad investor is to not invest at all. So just invest in the stock market on a regular basis. Do it for your kids so that when they get that knowledge, they have some capital to work with. The last part, the D stands for discipline. Discipline means that even when you know what you need to do, sometimes you still don't do it. So you teach your kids how to have economic discipline, how to engage in delayed gratification, how to make sure that the long term is more important than the short term. They do things today that'll put them in a better position tomorrow.
Banking in itself is the ability to be able to accumulate money and wealth over time. Stock is a component of allowing you to grow that wealth. And so for many people, you have to think about, what is my overall goal? If my goal is to accumulate wealth, I would say the first thing you should consider doing is buying a home, having a savings account, and a checking account. As you begin to move along the continuum of growing your wealth, you have to think about things such as protection, such as insurance. And you also think about things that allow you to grow your wealth, such as stocks and bonds. And so as I think about banking services and financial services, the ability to be able to save, use a checking account, have a good credit score, buying into a home, buying protection through insurance, sets you up to be able to grow your wealth in investing in stocks and bonds.
It's imperative that Black people begin to see themselves differently. And to do this, we must understand that whoever controls the images controls your self-esteem, self-respect, and self-development. Whoever controls the history controls the vision.
We by Black, our purpose has been to focus in on how do we change the perception of Black people globally. How do we get Black people to see themselves and the world differently, beyond what they've been taught?
The definition of your being determines your behavior. If I could begin to help our people to understand that I am a spirit being housed in a physical container, having a human experience, then I can begin to talk about what human experience activates, elevates my being. It is not the acquisition of things. You follow me? And so this notion of consumerism is really driven by the thing is what's important and not the being. And so the more things I get, then the more value I have. That has to be flipped, or at least that flip, our way has to be rescued. And so it is the elevation of my beingness that dictates what my relationship is to things. That would be the way to augment or at least to begin to address this sort of rabid consumerism that we're suffering from. That's been something that's been imposed in our psyches. And so we're taught, not just Africa, but everybody in the Western world taught that your value is in what you own.
How do you foster financial literacy in the position of First Independence Bank? We see that as a very foundational issue that we have to talk about on a daily basis. In a capitalistic society, one of the most important things is your financial reputation, also known as your credit score. The ability to be able to pay your bills on time, have a checking and a savings account is the first step to being able to acquire one of the first wealth building entities, which is your home. And being able to move that farther along allows for you to build wealth over time for your family.
The blueprint for economic development and empowerment for Black people is twofold. One, we have to get into Black nationalism. I firmly believe that. We got to pull our trillion-dollar consumer resources together and produce the things that we're consuming. While we're doing that, pulling our resources together, taking over the institutions economically, buying up the land, we need to start community land trusts. Those are not-for-profit corporations that can get the government to give you land, like they're giving it to the private developers. Then we need to pull our resources and do things like the Nation of Islam is doing and other black nationalist groups, buying up land, buying up real estate in our neighborhoods, and build a community economy. That's road number one. Road number two, while we're doing that, take over the politics.
Supporting black businesses.
There are a lot of people who talk about supporting black-owned businesses and buying black. The only issue is, where do you find them? So with the official Black Wall Street app, we made it extremely easy. You can go on there and you can search through different categories, anything from restaurants to pharmacies. You can search through different locations, even finding what's open now. You can search special offers, and if you're walking by a black-owned business, it'll alert you. So let's say you're in Harlem and you're looking for a restaurant for brunch, you can search on the app and you can go to Chocolat. If you are, trying to work out after that, you can search through the fitness category and you can find Harlem Cycle and get a workout in. And if you're looking for a hat, you can go to Flamekeeper's Hat Club and support black businesses in that way.
So as we look at the importance of cooperative economics in the black community, the importance of family as a gateway to obtaining capital must be looked at in a serious way. We must also examine intergenerational wealth as a vital instrument.
When people choose to accumulate, the question is, accumulating to what end? Are you accumulating for yourself to make a better life for yourself? Are you accumulating to make a better life for yourself and your kids? Do you want to make sure that the next generation is better off than the previous generation was? If families leave money to the next generation is better off. We've seen this with other communities. We've seen it less with the African American community, partially because the African American community, there has not always been that much to leave. But that's changing. The baby boom, as a group of people who many have worked in civil service jobs and other kind of jobs where they will have pensions, where they will have retirement funds, where they will have money. And so, when you look at that, the question is, then what's your connection to your family? Who are you going to leave this to? And if family ties are weak, the possibility of intergenerational wealth is also weak. I mean, if people don't know their families, who are you going to leave it to? So that's the connection. Is wealth, again, is not what you cop, it's what you keep. What are you keeping it for? Are you keeping it so that you can, go around the world on a cruise at 80? Or are you keeping it because you know that your son or daughter is going to want to buy a house, because your grandchildren are going to need tuition, because people always are better off when they have some wealth than when they don't. But so the family connect is better off family, not just better off personal.
Because at the beginning of this whole process is family. Family is the foundation of civilization. Economics is where the family anchors itself in civilization, because it allows that family to provide the essentials and the necessity to live and to reproduce, and then teach them how to live and reproduce by providing the economic foundation necessary.
Everything that happens starts in the cauldron of family life. All our genius is first nurtured in family. In fact, even all our degradation gets either overlooked and festered in the cauldron of family. So family life is the most important social system that humans can even engage in. And we have to make sure we protect and advance our sense of family as African people.
Music has always been a tool for social change. The question that must be raised is, can hip-hop be used to help educate the youth? Can the music once again be a positive mediator for change?
Can this corporate rap be an agent for change in the black community? It already is, but just not a change for the good. Can hip-hop be an agent for change? Absolutely. It might even, turn into something else. We might not even call it hip-hop.
Like musicians and entertainers, black athletes can create an economic solution to many of the problems that face the black community in terms of using their money, their power, and their stature to create institutions, build institutions. Entertainers have done it, contemporary musicians have done it, particularly pop musicians have done it. Black athletes have done it individually. They've done it separately. LeBron James has done his foundation. This guy's done their foundation. The problem in athletics has been the lack of a collectivity to collectively attack a problem, which is ironic because particularly in team sports, it takes a team to achieve a goal.
In a time when we see the expansion of new Black businesses, should entrepreneurship be looked at as a method to gain wealth?
The advice I would give to new entrepreneurs is to understand that the road to success is not a straight line. It's not a simple path. It's one that will lead you into a lot of situations that you think you can't get out of. It'll lead you into a lot of situations where you're gonna wonder, why am I doing this? And so it's very, very important that you find something to compensate yourself with other than money, because that's what's gonna keep you going when the money isn't flowing yet. And you also, in your quest for freedom, should understand that the life of a free person isn't the same as the life of somebody who's not free.
In a system like politics that was bland around white superiority, should Blacks look to this arena as a form of solution? Can politics be a method?
You know why I wanted to be a politician in a time when we disenfranchised? Because of power. Power. We could talk all the talk we want. You can walk all the miles you want to walk. You better have some power. That's why I got into the electoral arena. Because you are disenfranchised, then you need to enfranchise yourself with power. We need to not leave any field uncontested in our fight for our liberation. And the electoral arena is certainly one that has power. When I can bring in 6,000 units of real affordable housing, you can't go nowhere in New York City and get a studio apartment for the homeless that have subsidized rents for $215 a month. I was able to secure our movement out here, Operation Power, apartments for people who make $25,000, $35,000, $45,000. That's the area median income of my neighborhood. For people who are making $45,000, $50,000, three-bedroom apartment, $800, $900. Man, some people are paying $1,500 for a studio. So we were able to secure all that. Why? Because I was in politics. I was the council member. And when a developer came to me to tell me what was affordable for my neighborhood, and they said they building affordable housing, I said, affordable to who?
Real estate. How has it been used to gain wealth, and what should we do to gain capital in this market?
So there was a time that places like Harlem and Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn were considered nearly capitals of Black America. But there's been tremendous transformation over the last 2 decades. At this point, it's so difficult to invest in these markets. It takes tremendous capital. So what we should be considering is investing in cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore, and yes, even Detroit. We have to attempt to remain ahead of the curve in order to be able to take control of our communities.
Our journey now takes a look at the evolution of money to see how we have gone from crops to stocks and what the value of paper currency is in the United States and other countries.
So we've gone from people trading with beads and symbols to people trading with money, with paper. And some of the paper is, if you want to break it down, what is a dollar really worth? I mean, it's a really interesting question when you look at it from a global perspective. The development of paper currency is interesting because who says what the paper currency is worth? I mean, that becomes a question mark. And that's how you end up with a central bank. For the longest time, we worked on a gold model, on a gold standard here in the United States. And it was, I think gold at that time was $35 an ounce, but there was a fixed price of gold. And then at a point in time, it became clear that there's a certain amount of gold, and you didn't want to link the expansion of economies to just there's a certain amount of gold. But there was a point in time when we had gold, and there was gold that backed literally every dollar. And then the Bretton Woods Agreement released us from the gold standard. Meanwhile, internationally, every country has a currency, and those country currencies are based on what their value is. Oftentimes, they were pegged to gold. In more modern times, they've been pegged at some level to the dollar. The U.S. dollar has somehow become the international currency.
In the new e-commerce era, how does cryptocurrency play a part? What is cryptocurrency? And should we invest in this market?
Cryptocurrency is a lot deeper than Bitcoin. Basically, cryptocurrency is sort of this whole new world where they're taking value that exists within a specific niche, and they're allowing that value to be translated through the creation of markets into actual economic value. And so cryptocurrency is, to some extent, the creation of digital money. It doesn't seem real, but actually when you study the history of money, you find out that money pretty much, for the most part, isn't real either. And so cryptocurrency kind of leans on this ideology by basically saying, look, there's going to be value here. There's going to be a market. There's a circle of people that are going to be trading some sort of value with each other, whether they're trading space on a hard drive or trading memberships to the gym or whatever the case may be. And we're going to create this digital currency that allows us to communicate that value to each other. And that currency is going to have economic value that translates into dollar bills.
What's the difference in the various forms of cryptocurrencies?
Cryptocurrency doesn't so much differ from Bitcoin as much as it simply says that cryptocurrency is much bigger than Bitcoin, right? You've got Bitcoin there, and that's real, and that's part of what they call the blockchain, which is really the great innovation in cryptocurrency. It's the blockchain technology that allows there to be trust within this economic system. Trust is one of the most important factors that allows an economic system to survive. If trust suddenly disappeared in the American economic system, then the value of the dollar would go down to nothing. That's how currencies disappears, when trust disappears. So the blockchain actually allows trust to hold an economic system together, and from that came Bitcoin. But Bitcoin isn't the only cryptocurrency. There are over 1,000 different cryptocurrencies out here. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, most of them are scams, but there are some real doozies in there that are going to have huge amounts of value in the future if you listen to some of the analysts. I think the big question with cryptocurrency right now, though, is whether or not it's actually going to pan out to be what it can become, or if the regulators are going to disrupt the growth in cryptocurrency, and that's yet to be determined.
The ultimate goal is to bring back positive investments into our communities that translate into wealth from generation to generation.
So the question is, what should we think about, or what action plans should take place that will allow for the effective utilization of money in the communities of African Americans? This question has been asked many times. It's been talked about for many years. It was an issue for Dr. King as he was coming to the close of his life, talking about silver rights, SILVER rights. And so I would propose, as we think about money and how we utilize money, asking myself daily, where's the end result of this currency I'm spending? Does it impact my local community every day? Do I have dollars that are deposited into an institution that's going to support the efforts that I expect on a daily basis? And I think if we begin to challenge ourselves in that way, we will find that as a culture that has $1.2 trillion in spending power, and we only see the accumulation of those into assets in banks of only $5.5 billion, we see there's a big disparity. And so as we think about urban areas, as we think about rural areas that are dear to us, we have to ask ourselves, what am I doing to either contribute or take away from the ability of the dollar to translate into job production in areas that I am most concerned about?
Now that we've studied and analyzed our ancestors of the Nile Valley and saw how they used the environment and ecology to create the wealth that produced the civilization we know as Kemet, we need to now look at the environment we're in, the ecology that we're in, and see how we can use the wealth in this ecology to profit us. And the wealth in the urban ecology is tax revenues, it's real estate, it's wholesale and retail businesses. And when we learn to use that to our advantage, we will be able to create the political power in the community. So we decide who goes to City Hall, who goes to state government, who goes to Washington to represent and to manage the wealth and protect the wealth that we built in this community. And the last piece would be the culture that gives the ethical, moral principles to guide the political mind that protects the wealth that we've created out of the environment we find ourselves in. These are all practical solutions that we can use for now to help us develop the wealth, the power, and the control over ourselves and our neighborhood that will give us a future that is positive and prosperous.
Now that we've come full circle in our journey to find the role economics has played in the development of civilization, we have seen examples of greatness using what they had at their disposal to achieve their dreams.